There's a point at which being noticed stops functioning as a psychological requirement. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like progress. It does not arrive as relief. Most people only recognize it indirectly, by noticing what no longer happens inside them. Situations that once generated a subtle internal pull now pass without traction. Being acknowledged does not produce energy. Being overlooked does not produce tension. The nervous system no longer orients itself toward response. This absence is easy to misread, because recognition has long operated below awareness. The need to be seen rarely appears as a conscious desire. It embeds itself in ordinary behavior. It shapes how people speak, how they explain themselves, how they time their actions. It influences what feels worth sharing, and what feels incomplete if left unspoken. When this need weakens, it does not leave behind a clear outline. What remains is a quiet discontinuity. You may notice that you no longer anticipate reaction. There is less internal rehearsal before speaking, fewer imagined responses after acting. The mind does not circle around how something will be received. This can feel strange, because anticipation has often functioned as a bridge between inner experience and outer validation. Without it, experience feels more contained. Not restricted, contained. Containment here is not defensive. It is structural. Earlier in psychological development, being seen plays a stabilizing role. Identity forms through reflection. The individual learns who they are by noticing how they are perceived. This process is neither pathological nor optional. It is foundational. Recognition provides feedback. Feedback organizes behavior. Behavior reinforces identity. Over time, this loop becomes automatic. The psyche learns to regulate itself through response. Attention from others confirms existence. Reaction stabilizes self-image. Even disagreement functions as recognition, because it confirms that one has been registered. In this context, invisibility can feel threatening. Silence from others may produce anxiety. A lack of response can be interpreted as rejection or erasure. But this mechanism is not permanent. It belongs to a specific developmental configuration, one in which identity depends on external reflection to remain coherent. When that configuration reorganizes, the need to be seen loses its central role. This does not happen because recognition is judged unnecessary or unhealthy. It happens because internal coherence reaches a threshold where constant reflection is no longer required. The psyche stops leaning outward to confirm itself. This shift often occurs without any obvious trigger. There is no singular event that explains it. No dramatic success or failure precedes it. No relational rupture marks its arrival. It emerges gradually, then suddenly feels undeniable. One day, you may realize that you did something without feeling the urge to share it. Not as restraint, not as secrecy, simply because sharing did not feel relevant. Another time, you may notice that misunderstanding does not activate the usual impulse to clarify. The body remains neutral. The mind does not mobilize to correct perception. These moments accumulate quietly. They do not form a narrative. They do not demand interpretation. They simply register as differences. The absence of need to be seen can initially feel like a loss of orientation. For a long time, attention from others may have functioned as a compass. It indicated direction. It provided reassurance that one was moving correctly. When that compass no longer exerts force, direction does not disappear, but it changes how it is sensed. Direction becomes internal rather than referential. This is often misinterpreted as withdrawal. The individual may wonder whether they are disengaging from life or losing interest in others. But disengagement carries aversion. What appears here does not. There is no push away. There is simply no pull. The psyche no longer stretches itself outward in anticipation of response. Experience remains closer to where it originates. Carl Jung described the ego as the center of consciousness, not the center of the whole personality. Recognition hunger belongs to the ego's attempt to maintain itself through reflection. It relies on being perceived to feel continuous. When the center of gravity shifts away from the ego, this reliance weakens. The ego does not disappear. It loses exclusivity. This loss is not experienced as diminishment. It is experienced as quiet redistribution. Energy that was once spent managing visibility becomes available for other functions. Attention that was once directed toward response settles into perception. This redistribution does not create excitement. It creates calm. Calm here does not mean peace. It means absence of internal urgency. Urgency often originates in the need to be registered. When that need dissolves, urgency recalibrates. What remains urgent is what is necessary, not what will be noticed. This recalibration can feel unsettling because it removes a familiar source of momentum. Many actions may have been sustained by the anticipation of acknowledgement. Without that anticipation, motivation changes texture. Movement becomes less dramatic, less driven by projection into others' reactions, less organized around outcome visibility. This does not mean movement stops. It becomes quieter. The quietness can be mistaken for loss of vitality, but vitality is not synonymous with display. Display amplifies energy outward. Vitality can exist without amplification. When recognition hunger fades, emotional expression also changes. Emotional responses become more proportional, less escalated, less performative. This is not emotional blunting. Feelings still occur. They simply do not intensify for the sake of signaling. Earlier, emotion may have functioned as a way to communicate presence. Intensity ensured visibility. Without the need to be seen, intensity is no longer recruited for that purpose. This can make emotional life feel flatter at first. But what is missing is not feeling. It is exaggeration. The psyche stops dramatizing itself. This is often when people worry that they are becoming indifferent. But indifference implies lack of care. What appears here is lack of dependency. Care remains. Attachment remains. Interest remains. Dependency on being noticed does not. This distinction matters because dependency creates vulnerability. When identity relies on reflection, absence of reflection threatens coherence. When identity consolidates internally, absence becomes tolerable. Tolerance replaces vigilance. The absence of recognition hunger also changes how people relate to social spaces. Social interaction may continue, but the internal stakes are lower. One can participate without needing to extract confirmation. This reduces friction. There is less pressure to perform a consistent identity, less need to manage impressions, less anxiety about being accurately perceived. Accuracy loses its urgency. This does not mean truth becomes irrelevant. It means truth is no longer negotiated externally. Truth becomes experiential rather than representational. Representation was necessary when identity was fragile. It allowed the self to stabilize through articulation. When identity stabilizes internally, representation becomes optional. Silence becomes a legitimate state. Not silence as withholding. Silence as sufficiency. This sufficiency does not isolate. It allows connection without dependency. Interaction can occur without the underlying question of how one is being received. This removes a layer of tension from relationships. Others may still expect explanation or visibility. Social norms do not change immediately, but internally, the compulsion weakens. The individual may still speak, share, and engage, but without the sense that these actions are required to remain real. Reality no longer depends on being acknowledged. This can alter how memory functions. Earlier, experiences may have been stored with an implicit audience in mind. Even private moments were often framed for later telling. Without recognition hunger, experience does not need to be preserved for display. Memory becomes less theatrical. Moments do not need to be turned into narratives to feel complete. This can make life feel more immediate, not more intense, more present. Presence here does not mean mindfulness. It means absence of projection. Attention stays closer to the actual event rather than being split between experience and imagined reception. This split had been subtle but persistent. Its resolution is felt as a reduction in inner fragmentation. The psyche becomes less divided between living and showing. This reduction does not feel like an achievement. It does not produce satisfaction. It feels normal, even though it is unfamiliar. This unfamiliar normality can be difficult to articulate. Language tends to frame change as gain or loss. What occurs here is neither. It is reorganization. Reorganization does not announce itself. It simply changes what functions. The need to be seen no longer functions as a regulator. Without it, the system does not collapse. It recalibrates. What becomes apparent is that much of what once felt urgent was sustained by the expectation of response. When response is no longer anticipated, urgency falls away. This does not make life smaller. It makes it quieter. Quiet here is not emptiness. It is absence of unnecessary signal. Signal was required when identity needed reinforcement. Without that need, signal becomes redundant. The psyche stops broadcasting itself. This cessation is not chosen. It is not a decision to withdraw. It is a natural consequence of internal consolidation. When consolidation reaches a certain point, external scaffolding is no longer required. The individual does not become invisible. Visibility simply loses its function. This distinction is critical. Losing function is not the same as losing capacity. One can still be seen. One simply no longer needs it. This realization does not arrive as insight. It arrives as a fact, noticed only because something familiar is no longer present. And that absence does not ask to be filled. It remains quietly as the background condition of experience. When the need to be seen weakens, the psyche does not immediately understand what is happening. The change is structural, but interpretation lags behind. For a long time, recognition has functioned as an organizing force. It has shaped attention, behavior, and emotional response so thoroughly that its absence creates confusion rather than clarity. The mind attempts to explain the change using familiar categories, even when those categories no longer fit. One of the most common explanations is fatigue. People assume they are tired of others, tired of effort, tired of engagement. But fatigue implies depletion. What is occurring here is not depletion. Energy has not vanished. Interest has not collapsed. Capacity remains intact. What disappears is the emotional payoff of being acknowledged. Another explanation is detachment. People worry they're becoming distant, cold, or unavailable. But detachment carries a defensive quality. It creates distance to protect against intrusion. What emerges here does not protect. It simply does not reach. There is no wall. There is no withdrawal. There is no refusal. There is a lack of necessity. This lack is difficult to recognize because necessity has long been implicit rather than explicit. Recognition did not feel like something required. It felt like something natural, even incidental. Yet it quietly structured behavior. People spoke because being heard mattered. They shared because response completed experience. They explained because clarity stabilized identity. When recognition loses its organizing role, these behaviors lose momentum. This loss of momentum is not intentional. The psyche does not decide to stop seeking validation. It stops responding to it. Validation still occurs. Compliments are still offered. Attention is still given. But the internal system no longer registers these inputs as essential. They land and pass through. This can be unsettling because validation once functioned as evidence of existence. Without it, the mind briefly wonders what anchors identity now. The answer is not immediately accessible because the anchor is not conceptual. It is experiential. Identity no longer relies on confirmation to feel continuous. Continuity is maintained internally. This internal continuity changes how emotional reactions unfold. Previously, emotional response often included a social dimension. Feelings were not only felt, they were prepared for reception. Even private emotions were often shaped by how they might be understood or misunderstood by others. Without the need for validation, this shaping weakens. Emotion becomes less anticipatory. It does not lean toward explanation. It does not rehearse how it will be perceived. This does not make emotion weaker. It makes it simpler. Simplicity is often mistaken for dullness, especially in cultures that equate intensity with aliveness. But intensity here was frequently driven by the need to register impact. Without that need, emotional amplitude decreases. The decrease can feel disorienting. People may assume something has gone missing. But what has gone missing is amplification, not feeling. This distinction becomes clearer when looking at how disappointment is experienced. Earlier, disappointment often carried a social dimension. It involved not only loss, but also perceived judgment. Failure threatened identity because it disrupted how one appeared. Without validation dependency, disappointment still occurs, but it does not spiral. It registers, informs, and subsides. There is less self-referential escalation. Similarly, success changes texture. Achievement no longer inflates identity. It satisfies without enlarging the sense of self. Pride becomes muted, not suppressed, but uninvited. This muting can be misread as lack of ambition. But ambition fueled by validation differs from ambition grounded in necessity. The former seeks visibility. The latter does not. When validation loses authority, ambition reorganizes. Some pursuits fall away entirely. Others remain, but operate differently. Action becomes less performative. The psyche no longer asks, "How will this look?" with the same urgency. Instead, attention shifts toward coherence. Does this align internally? Does it fit? Fit replaces approval. This replacement does not announce itself. It is noticed indirectly, through the disappearance of certain inner negotiations. Decisions feel less debated. Justifications feel unnecessary. One does not feel more confident. Confidence implies assertion. What emerges is a lack of contest. There is nothing to prove. The breakdown of external validation also alters how comparison functions. Comparison relies on shared metrics. It requires that identity be evaluated in relation to others. Validation supplies the emotional charge that makes comparison meaningful. Without validation dependency, comparison loses traction. Others' achievements no longer provoke the same internal response. Their progress does not feel like commentary on one's own position. This does not produce superiority or inferiority. It produces neutrality. Neutrality is often misunderstood as apathy, but apathy involves disengagement. Neutrality involves proportion. The psyche no longer exaggerates the significance of external markers. This proportionality extends to social hierarchies. Status signals lose their emotional force. Titles, roles, and recognition may still be acknowledged cognitively, but they no longer organize self-worth. This shift can feel destabilizing because social structures rely on shared investment in these signals. When one person disengages internally, they may feel slightly out of alignment with the surrounding environment, not alienated. Misaligned. Misalignment here is not oppositional. It is non-participatory. The individual is still present, still functional, but no longer governed by the same incentives. This can create moments of silence where explanation would previously have occurred. The person may notice they do not feel compelled to clarify intentions, defend choices, or contextualize actions. Explanation loses urgency because it no longer secures anything internally. This can be confusing to others, but internally it feels natural. There is no sense of withholding. There is simply no impulse to externalize. The psyche becomes more selective in its outputs, not because it is guarding itself, but because output is no longer used as a stabilizing mechanism. This selectivity can initially feel like shrinking. Less is said, less is shared, less is displayed. But what is shrinking is not engagement. It is excess. Excess communication often served to regulate anxiety around being seen. Without that anxiety, excess loses purpose. This reveals how much effort was previously spent maintaining visibility, not in obvious ways, but through countless small acts of signaling, tone adjustments, clarifications, strategic disclosures. When these acts fall away, the psyche conserves energy. This conservation does not feel like restraint. It feels like relief from unnecessary labor, labor that was invisible because it was normalized. The breakdown of external validation also affects how identity narratives function. Earlier, identity may have been maintained through story. One told oneself who one was by recounting experiences, roles, and achievements. Without validation dependency, these stories lose emotional charge. They may still be true, but they no longer feel necessary to repeat. Identity becomes less narrative-driven. This does not erase memory. It reduces the need to use memory as proof. Proof of existence, proof of coherence, proof of worth. When proof is no longer required, memory reorganizes. Experiences do not need to be framed as milestones. They can remain as events. This changes the relationship to time. The past becomes less explanatory. The future becomes less anticipatory. The present carries more weight, not because it is emphasized, but because it is no longer overshadowed by imagined evaluation. Evaluation had been a constant background process. How will this be judged? How will it be interpreted? How will it reflect on me? Without validation authority, evaluation loses its grip. This does not eliminate discernment. Discernment remains. Judgment remains. But they are no longer internalized as threats. The psyche no longer organizes itself around avoiding negative evaluation or securing positive evaluation. This frees attention. Attention turns inward, not as introspection, but as attunement. The system becomes more sensitive to internal signals because external signals are no longer prioritized. This sensitivity is not emotional hypersensitivity. It is functional awareness, awareness of limits, awareness of capacity, awareness of necessity. These internal signals guide behavior more reliably than external feedback ever did. But this guidance is subtle. It does not shout. It does not insist. It simply persists. Jung emphasized that individuation involved the withdrawal of psychic energy from collective norms. Validation is one of the most powerful collective regulators. When energy withdraws from it, the psyche begins to operate according to its own internal logic. This logic is not always communicable. Others may not understand why certain choices are made or not made, but understanding from others no longer functions as a requirement. This can create a sense of standing alone, but not in isolation. Alone, in the sense of not being governed. The breakdown of external validation does not produce immediate clarity. It produces quiet. Quiet in which new forms of orientation begin to emerge. Orientation based on necessity rather than recognition. Necessity does not argue. It does not persuade. It does not seek agreement. It simply asserts itself through persistence. This persistence becomes noticeable in how certain actions continue even without encouragement. Tasks are completed without anticipation of acknowledgement. Effort is applied without expectation of response. This can feel anticlimactic. But anticlimax is only disappointing when climax was expected. Without expectation, completion feels sufficient. The psyche begins to accept sufficiency. Sufficiency is not satisfaction. It is adequacy without embellishment. This adequacy stabilizes behavior. Life becomes less reactive to external fluctuations. Praise and criticism lose their power to redirect internal course. This does not make the individual rigid. It makes them less deflectable. Deflection often occurred through validation. Attention could pull one off course. Disapproval could derail intention. Without validation dependency, direction becomes steadier. This steadiness is not dramatic. It is often invisible to others. But internally, it registers as reduced friction. Friction between inner sense and outer response diminishes. The psyche no longer tries to reconcile itself with every external input. This reconciliation had been exhausting, though often unnoticed. When it stops, there is space. Not space to fill. Space to remain unoccupied. This unoccupied space does not demand activity. It allows experience to unfold without commentary. And within that space, the individual begins to recognize something quietly but decisively. External validation no longer defines what is real. Reality does not need endorsement. It stands on its own. When the need to be seen no longer organizes behavior, authority quietly relocates. This relocation is not dramatic. There is no internal announcement, no sense of empowerment. It is noticed only through absence. For much of life, authority has been borrowed. It has come from reaction, agreement, approval, and recognition. Decisions felt legitimate when they were mirrored. Direction felt secure when it was acknowledged. This borrowing was not conscious. It did not feel like dependence. It felt like orientation. The psyche learned to calibrate itself by watching how it was received. When recognition hunger dissolves, this calibration system loses relevance. The psyche no longer checks itself against response. This does not immediately produce confidence or certainty. What appears first is a lack of reference. Choices are made without the familiar sense of being reinforced. This can feel exposed, even though nothing is at risk. Exposure here is not about being seen. It is about acting without endorsement. Endorsement had once served as confirmation that action was permissible, reasonable, or justified. Without it, action proceeds without commentary. This changes the internal texture of decision-making. Decisions become quieter, less rehearsed, less defended. There is less internal dialogue around how a choice will be interpreted. The mind does not simulate reaction in advance. It does not prepare explanations. Action becomes unaccompanied. This unaccompanied quality can be mistaken for uncertainty. People may assume they lack confidence because they no longer feel buoyed by approval. But confidence relied on external reinforcement. What emerges here does not. There is no emotional lift, no affirmation, no sense of being validated. There is simply movement, movement without narrative. This alters how responsibility is experienced. Earlier, responsibility included an audience. One felt accountable not only for outcomes, but for how those outcomes would be perceived. Without recognition hunger, responsibility becomes internal. It is no longer about appearing reliable. It is about responding to what is necessary. Necessity replaces expectation. Necessity does not negotiate. It does not seek agreement. It does not require explanation. It persists until addressed. This persistence becomes the new organizing force. People may notice that certain actions continue even when no one knows about them. Effort is applied without anticipation of acknowledgement. Completion feels complete without response. This is not discipline. It is coherence. Coherence does not require pressure. Carl Jung understood individuation as a withdrawal of psychic authority from collective norms. Authority derived from the collective depends on visibility. Authority derived from the self does not. This does not eliminate the collective. It removes its governing role. The psyche becomes less reactive to expectation. Expectation had functioned as a command. Without recognition hunger, its authority weakens. This does not produce rebellion. It produces indifference. Indifference not as apathy, but as lack of leverage. Expectation no longer determines movement. This can be unsettling in social environments that rely on consensus. Others may expect justification. Silence may be interpreted as resistance or ambiguity. Internally, there is neither. Authority has simply moved. This movement affects how conflict is experienced. Disagreement no longer threatens legitimacy. One can register opposition without mobilizing defense. Defense had been necessary when authority was external. Without that dependency, disagreement becomes information rather than threat. This reduces strain. Strain had come from constant adjustment, adjusting identity to maintain alignment with perceived response, adjusting behavior to avoid negative evaluation. Without recognition hunger, adjustment becomes selective. The psyche adjusts when reality requires it, not when visibility demands it. This selectivity reshapes boundaries. Boundaries no longer require justification. They are not enforced aggressively. They are simply present. Presence replaces enforcement. Presence does not argue. This also alters how time is experienced. Productivity no longer needs to be visible to feel real. Busyness loses its signaling function. Activity becomes precise. Precision replaces volume. Much of what once felt necessary falls away because it was sustained by recognition rather than need. What remains feels leaner, not chosen, functional. Identity itself reorganizes under this logic. Identity no longer needs to be asserted. It functions through continuity rather than display. Continuity does not require reinforcement. This produces a form of trust, though not in the motivational sense. It is structural trust. The psyche trusts its own coherence. This trust does not feel like belief. It feels like absence of doubt. Doubt had been fueled by uncertainty of response. Without response as reference, doubt loses traction. This does not create certainty. It creates tolerance. Tolerance for ambiguity. Tolerance for silence. Tolerance for being undefined. Being undefined no longer threatens authority. One can act without knowing how it will be perceived. One can choose without securing agreement. This reduces anticipatory anxiety. Anxiety had often arisen from imagined reaction. Without that projection, the mind quiets. Error is processed differently as well. Mistakes are no longer framed as failures of identity. They are corrected without humiliation. Humiliation requires an audience. Without an audience, error becomes information. Learning continues without collapse. Success changes too. Achievement does not inflate identity. It satisfies necessity and then recedes. Completion feels sufficient. Sufficiency becomes intelligible. Sufficiency does not need confirmation. This stabilizes the psyche. Life continues without constant reinforcement. Difficulty remains, but it no longer threatens identity. What once amplified difficulty was visibility. Without that amplification, experience becomes proportionate. Proportion restores balance. Balance here is not stillness. It is reduced oscillation. The psyche becomes less reactive, more responsive. Response replaces reaction. Response is slower, quieter, and less dramatic. Others may not notice this change immediately. Externally, behavior may appear similar. Internally, the organizing logic has shifted. Authority no longer comes from outside. Visibility no longer governs reality. Reality is lived without negotiation. When the need to be seen dissolves, nothing essential is lost. What changes is where legitimacy resides. Experience no longer requires confirmation to be real. Action no longer needs to be witnessed to hold weight. Identity continues without being reflected. What remains is not certainty or confidence, but coherence. Life does not become louder or clearer. It becomes sufficient without explanation. If this description matches something you're already living, you're welcome to stay with the channel. You can subscribe to the Inner Shadow Signal if these reflections help you recognize changes that are difficult to name. If someone else is moving through a similar quiet shift, sharing the video may help them understand it without instruction. And if you want, you can leave a comment describing what changed for you when being seen stop matching.